Thank you for being here. My name is John Shaw, and I'm the director of the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute, and want to thank you for all making the effort to be here. As someone who grew up in central Illinois and once or twice strayed to the southern part of the state, I know you don't just sort of bump into Carbondale. You have to, there has to be some intentionality to get here. In fact, I remember a year or two ago, Governor Edgar was presiding over I think it was the 20th anniversary of the Institute, and his opening remarks, I saw this on YouTube, I wasn't here at the time, but his opening remark was, he goes, "God, I forgot how hard it is to get to Carbondale." And then he got back to it, making a lavish tribute to the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute. So I know it's hard to get here, and we do appreciate all of you for making the effort. And I also know it's a difficult and complicated time of the year. It's spring, and finals are approaching, both for students and teachers and papers, et cetera. So we do really appreciate your effort to be here. Let me just say a couple words about the genesis of this conference, and then I will kick it over to our keynote speaker. I guess it was actually early last fall, the Institute has a group of student ambassadors, and we're discussing some things we could do to help the state. You know, we hear so much about how badly the state is struggling, and trying to think about sort of a positive thing we could do. We went back and forth about possible debate or some sort of way to focus on policy issues. And I happened to be in Chicago seeing a friend of mine who's the president of the Civic Federation. His name is Lawrence Massal, and we're talking back and forth. And I was saying, well, maybe we could collaborate with you on a budget conference or something. And he looked at me and he says, "The world does not need another budget conference with think tank people who've been circulating the same papers for the last 10 or 20 years." He said, "We need to hear some fresh voices and get some fresh perspectives." And that resonated with me. Not to get into my background too much, but I grew up in Peoria. I went to Knox College. My first couple jobs were in Springfield. Then I went overseas. I lived in Australia and Belgium, and then in Washington, D.C. for 26 years. Then I moved back to Illinois about a year ago, and my first thought upon returning is, what's happened? And by that I mean, of course, the state hadn't changed physically, but the political culture had changed dramatically. And when I started, I don't want to say it was a heroic age when giants were doing, amazing things, but there was a basic culture of problem solving and competence. And Democrats and Republicans would fight, but at the end of the session, they'd get together and they would put together a budget agreement and they'd pay the bills. And there was just this basic culture of just getting things done. The parties, they viewed each other as adversaries and opponents, not enemies. And then as I returned, it just seemed that things have shifted fairly dramatically. And part of what I'd like us to do, what I hope we can do, is think a little bit about what's happened and how that culture has been corroded. But I think more importantly, particularly for you, is to find out what solutions are, because many of you are going to be deciding in the next couple years whether this is where you want to stay. And we want to just think in some concrete ways about what are the barriers for staying in Illinois, what are some of the inducements that could be developed to have you stay. And I think our perception is that this conference will be successful if three things happen. First, that we get a better sense of just the complexity of problems that Illinois faces. It's a big state. In fact, I was talking to Jim Dolan just a bit ago, and I don't know that states are usually the political entity that we think about most. Local communities, you think about that as a governing institution, national politics, international. But I think, by and large, the state is not necessarily the unit of analysis. So I think by spending some time drilling down into what Illinois' challenges and opportunities are, could be quite a productive thing. Secondly, I hope we can emerge from the complexity of this discussion with some general views about the best way forward. And we hope to put together a document, a small report that we would send to the governor and the members of the General Assembly. And I think this could actually attract some attention and gather some notice. And I think our challenge is to be not so immersed in details that we get, lost in the nuances of how you structure a graduated income tax, but avoid just utter, generalities and platitudes, and finding that sort of middle ground where you make important statements without getting too caught in the detail. And finally, and I think perhaps most abstractly, we're hoping that this is the beginning of a kind of a networking opportunity for all of you who have a stake in the future of Illinois. And as your careers unfold and you have internships in Springfield or go to Chicago to work for law firms or work for companies like Caterpillar or John Deere, you keep in touch and develop a network of people who are also committed to making Illinois a better and more functional state. With that, I'd like to just briefly introduce our featured speaker, who is one of the ideal people to kind of put this into context. Jim Nolan has done pretty much everything. He's one of the wise men of Illinois politics, even though he's still very young. Jim was elected, he was a state representative in his 20s. He's been a cabinet director. He has presided over several transition teams. He's been a campaign manager. He's worked for 3 governors. Isn't that right, Jim?
3 unindicted governors.
Okay. This is opening day in baseball, so that was a hanging curveball that he was just tossed, and he just bounced it off the Green Monster in Boston. So, but Jim is a remarkable man in terms of just a great writer. He was kind enough to be the one who assembled this book that we thought would be a good way for all of us to begin our deliberations. He writes wonderful essays about both esoteric topics and even very kind of simple, touching ones. And in fact, one of my favorite, he wrote a essay on spending, he was traveling, and I guess he passed through a Denny's on Father's Day and just noted just the way the staff worked and just kind of had a very warm and evocative article. Jim's also written a fairly racy novel about Illinois politics, which I commend all of you to read sometime this. Yeah. So with that, let me just turn it over to Jim, and Jim will just kind of set the context for just where we are right now. And also before that, I want to just give a shout out to Erica Harold, who will be our keynote speaker tomorrow. She was very, very gracious about coming to the conference tonight and listening in and meeting people. So she's oftentimes when you have speakers, they come in the last minute, give a talk, and dash out the back door. But she's been very generous to come early, and I'm sure she'd love to chat with you after dinner, down to the bowling alley for a few minutes and all. So Erica, thank you so much for being here. And Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
I want to commend Jack and the Institute for putting on this confab, and I hope there are many more of them, because you are the ones who will renew Illinois if it's to be renewed. The curtain's coming down on the energies and any contributions that old duffers like John Jackson and I might make. But the curtain is rising right now in front of you, and within a decade, you will be entering civic, political, and governmental roles. Erica Harold, a Harvard Law graduate, has already made a strong run for an important state office. As Jack mentioned, I ran for the legislature when I was 24, lost, ran again when I was 26 and won, served a couple of terms, and then ran for state office. So it isn't far into the future that you guys will be making important, or taking important roles in our society. But why is it important to renew Illinois? After all, we're just one of 50 states. For me, it's because Illinois and my tiny little community of Toulon, where I grew up, gave me a wonderful, nurturing childhood and a fine education up through the PhD. And the more wealth and vitality a state has, the stronger the families, communities, and institutions of Illinois from which to nurture future generations and give them the same opportunities that I was so blessed to have. And the stronger our state, the stronger our state and local governments. Jack mentioned that there doesn't seem to be much focus on Illinois as Illinois. I have told my students that yes, international affairs is romantic, national government and politics are exciting, yet what are most citizens most concerned about most of the time. Clean water and sanitary sewer systems, which are really marvels of our globe, the environment and keeping it clean or making it cleaner, public safety, crime and incarceration and rehabilitation, schools from pre-kindergarten through our colleges and universities, including the private sector, which is so important, as I'll note in a moment, social services, the poor and neglected children, the mental health services for a big swath of us across our state, transportation, so critical to Southern Illinois. These are state and local responsibilities primarily, and the localities are creatures of the state. So the state is an important actor and often underappreciated. So the foregoing leads me to provide an overview of where we are, how did we get to where we are, and where do we aspire to go. And I'll take 20 minutes for that. I don't have a watch. I have a smartphone, but I don't want to pull it out to look. So Jack will give me a heads up at 15. Okay. I could tell a brief, and this will be a brief sketch of some of the history of Illinois through the leaders, the discoverers and the innovators in Illinois. Edward Coles, President Madison's private secretary, came to Illinois after statehood, and in 1824 he faced off against a state constituency that favored slavery. And they put onto the ballot a proposition to create a new constitution that would allow slavery, which would have thrown the Northwest Territories into a cocked hat had the convention been able to go forward. But he roused an important campaign, made lots of enemies, and defeated the pro-slavery forces in the 1824 election that denied this convention that would have, as I say, been terrible for the state of Illinois. Thomas Ford in the 1840s. The state was in terrible debt, just as we are today, maybe worse, because Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas and other state legislators had voted to spend huge amounts of money for canals and railroads and plank roads, money that we didn't have. And Thomas Ford stared down the legislature and said, you have to tax yourself to get us out of debt so that we have good standing with the nation and the English investors. The state did so reluctantly, and indeed then investment flowed into Illinois from the east and from England. Lincoln and Douglas, we of course know about and venerate. I think Douglas is underappreciated because not only did he come out strongly for the Union cause after Lincoln was elected and the nation was torn asunder, but he also was critical to the opening up of the West through the Intercontinental Railroad and through other efforts of his. John Peter Altgeld, who in the 1890s was one of the most courageous governors the state has ever had the benefit of. Many campuses, I know Northern and the U of I, have buildings named in honor of John Peter Altgeld, who was a strong proponent of higher education. Although more important probably was his courageous pardoning of the Haymarket anarchists who were unfairly imprisoned for a supposed role in a bombing during a rally in Chicago. The Haymarket riot is a fascinating piece of American history. I could go on about Altgeld. He refused a $1.5 million bribe at a time he was almost bankrupt and at a time when bribery was the standard operating procedure of the day. Jane Addams, Myra Bradwell. Jane Addams created the settlement house and thus the social work environment of the nation. And Myra Bradwell was an advocate. She was denied her bid to become a lawyer in Illinois, and so she rallied forces nationwide and took a leading role, probably the leading role, in making it possible for women to become members of the bar in Illinois and across the nation. And she was able to lead the challenge in the courts to have Mary Todd Lincoln removed from a mental institution where she was probably placed unfairly. Reagan, Obama, we know of them. Innovators and discoverers, Deere, McCormick, Julius Rosenwald, who created Sears, which was the Amazon of the early 1900s. Mark Andreessen from the University of Illinois, who created Mosaic, which is the template for the World Wide Web. And so we have lots of leaders to look back upon as models. A little later on, I'll talk about the challenge of leadership. But now let me just walk very quickly through this little booklet that Jack asked me to put together, which I'm sure you've all read line by line. And I'm kidding, I'm not expecting that. To give you a sense of where we are today. When your grandparents were college-aged, Illinois was a powerhouse. Our per capita income was among the highest among the states. Life was good and getting better. After World War II, our per capita income was 130% of the national average of 100%. Since then, we've been declining relative to the rest of the nation, slowly but steadily, until now we're 104%. So we're a little wealthier per capita than the nation as a whole in terms of income, but not nearly so wealthy as we were at one time. And indeed, the nature and faces of Illinois have been changing dramatically since that period of post-World War to the present, and I have a few factoids in the booklet. For example, the percentage of children born to married parents is down from 90% in 1968 to 59% today, which troubles me. But on the other hand, the percent of women in the General Assembly has increased from 2%, there were almost none there when I was elected in '68, to 38% today. So an important plus. On the other hand, the numbers of inmates in our prisons has risen from 7,000 when I was elected to the legislature in '68 to 49,000, and now it's come back down to 42,000. There's a change in the mix of who we are. When I was a youngster, Illinois was mostly a Caucasian state. Today, 38% of us, 36% of us are of so-called minority backgrounds, African American, Latino, Asian American, and so we're a different mix of folks, and that provides both some value to us and also some challenges. One of the fundamental topics you're going to talk about tomorrow is not sexy, and it's complicated, but it's not too complicated that you can't grab hold of the basics, and that has to do with the fiscal situation in the state. And I think John Jackson is going to be the moderator of your discussion there. And I think this is a fundamental block in the building blocks we need to work with in renewing Illinois. For the past 2 decades, Illinois, on average, has been spending and obligating about $3 billion a year, each year, more than it has been taking in revenue. And so our net assets have gone from minus $6 billion to minus $141 billion in that period of time. And this is critical because business that might want to locate here because of all of our strengths, which I'll touch on briefly in a minute or two, look at the state and say, well, gee, with all that debt and the fact you didn't have a budget for a couple of years and you're spending more than you're taking in, who's going to pay for that? If I locate a business in your state, am I going to have to pay for that, and how much will it be? And I don't know, so I'm not interested in locating in your state. So stabilizing our budget, unsexy as it is probably the most important thing we can do in the process of renewing Illinois. And this won't be easy because there's been a dramatic change over the years, as in our economy and as in the nature of our people, and also in the nature of how we spend our money. And there's a table in one of your on one of the pages of the booklet that points out that in 1978, latest year I could find, or the earliest year I could find good information on, Medicaid payments in Illinois for low-income people on health insurance of the state, we paid $599 per capita per year for the 3 million persons among us whom we help with Medicaid. And that was in 1978. In adjusted for inflation, same dollar value. In 2018, we spent $1,797 per person on per capita, each one of us, on persons receiving Medicaid. And so dramatic increase in that slice of the budget pie, which squeezes higher education and other functions of government, makes their slices smaller. And then pensions is the other one I'll mention, and that's not sexy either, but it's important to state employees and public university employees that they have a decent pension. But so we provided pension benefits, but we haven't been providing the money to build up a base of assets from which to pay the pensions later on. And so we've gone from $104 per person per capita in pension payments in 1978 to about $800 per capita per year in 2018. Again, squeezing the rest of the budget. So it's a big challenge for us, and you and John should have important discussions of how to go about solving this problem. You can cut expenditures, you can raise taxes, you can do a combination of things. It's challenging, and it's challenging for leadership, as I'll mention in another moment. Higher education is another topic that the Paul Simon Institute thought we ought to include in our discussions, and understandably that's important to all of us here. And I would simply note that in 2000, a national organization of higher education officials listed Illinois as having the best overall higher education system for both quality and affordability. And that's not the case today, unfortunately. So you have to wrestle with that topic as well. And we have a wonderfully rich mix of institutions. We have about 151 private colleges and universities. We have 12 public universities with several campuses each. We have 39 community colleges blanketing the state with many campuses. The private sector actually educates more undergraduates than does the public sector. So both sectors are very important to us. But in recent years, with budget problems that I've identified, spending more than you're taking in, so it's hard to keep spending even more. And indeed, you're pushed by Medicaid and pensions, and so the state has been spending less on higher education, significantly less in the past decade. And then we had 2 years without a budget, and then as a result, the public universities skyrocketed tuition in order to offset what they felt they weren't getting from the state general revenues. And lo and behold, states neighboring us said, gee, we also have declining high school graduation numbers, and it doesn't cost us much at the margin to educate an additional student. So why don't we go to Illinois and say, come over to the University of Iowa or Mizzou or Indiana, and we'll educate you for less than your tuition cost at Illinois universities. And so we've had a dramatic outflow of students. 44% of high school graduates last year who were going on to college did so out of the state of Illinois. Can we recapture them? And how? So that is another challenge that you have in this discussion. And I hope maybe it'll prompt some comments and observations and questions here in a couple of minutes. So can we, and then another topic is the transportation network, what I call our crown jewel. People don't appreciate the strengths of this state. Think of infrastructure alone. There's a map in this booklet points out that Illinois has one of the densest networks of interstates of any state in the nation. We have more miles of interstate highway than any states except Texas and California. 2,200 miles of interstate. All 7 major railroads run into and out of Chicago. It's the nation's rail hub, without doubt. Waterways. We have 1,000 miles or more of navigable waterways. Airports. O'Hare was recently named by an MIT study group to have the best domestic connections in the nation and the best international connections in the nation. So we have wonderful infrastructure resources, and we're in the middle of the country. Wouldn't Texas die to be in the middle of the country, so close to all of the markets that are within reach a day by truck? And so we have to keep up that infrastructure, but how do you pay for it? And that is a topic for discussion tomorrow, and that it sounds easy. You know, we need to improve our infrastructure. Well, why haven't we been doing it? Because we're afraid to take the actions necessary to do so. For example, we haven't increased the gas tax since 1992, and I don't like new taxes, but I think we're going to have more gas taxes if we're going to have better highways. Our interstates are 50 and 60 years old, and that's the typical life of interstate highways. They need not to be repaved, they need to be rebuilt. So big challenges for the infrastructure. Corruption. Jack wanted me to talk about our culture, our political culture for governance. And corruption is a major challenge we face. When I was a kid, my Uncle John Sanner was a house painter in tiny Wyoming, Illinois, and scraping by, new Republican governor. Governor said, John, I can get you a state job. John said, fine. I remember my dad telling me this story. And so John had his new state job, and he started getting checks. And John said, well, where do I go? He called in, where do I go to work? Where do I report? Oh, you don't have to report. He had a ghost payroller job, which was standard operating procedure in politics back in that era, my first introduction to corruption as such. So corruption is, I gave an exercise to students of mine in American politics classes at the U of I, and it's in the booklet. I don't have time to go through it at the moment. But basically the exercise said, would you, in a tough situation, advise your brother who has a DUI to take the offer of his lawyer to pay him an extra $1,000 in cash in order to get his problem taken care of, or not? In 7 courses I taught, I gave the exercise. 2/3 of the students in each class, one was 19 out of 24, said go for it. I mean, that's a conspiracy to commit a felony, because the $1,000 obviously was to go to pay off a judge or an officer of the court. Now, the point is, maybe, I'm not concluding this, maybe we have a sense in Illinois developed over the decades that if you have a chance to take advantage of government, do it. Because, as my students said, everybody else would. Why should I be the fool? Or it's a tough situation that I gave them in this situation, the brother with the DUI. But Illinois may have a kind of culture of corruption. For example, we have more convictions for public corruption per unit of population than any state except Louisiana. Surveys of the public about perceptions of corruption find that Illinois always ranks in the top 3 states in terms of perceptions of people on the East Coast, the Midwest, the West Coast, that Illinois is one of the most corrupt states in the nation. Well, does that make a difference? I did a survey of economic development officials, local officials, the ones who try to recruit a new business to come into town. 70 of them responded to this survey, which wasn't about this topic, but I threw in a question. Let's see, I want to make sure I get this correct. That the question had to do with, does the perception of corruption in Illinois have a negative effect on your ability to recruit businesses to come to the state? And 3 out of 4 said it had either a negative or a strongly negative impact on their recruiting because of perceptions of what you have to do business in Illinois. Now, the perception may not be fair, but it's there. And so that is another challenge that we face. And there is a topic, let's see, who's going to cover that? Well, I'm covering that one, yeah, in our discussions tomorrow, so it should be fun, because it's not going to, can we change the culture of Illinois? Culture can be changed. We changed it related to drunk driving. When I was a kid, nobody gave a thought about drunk driving. Smoking. Everybody smoked when I was a kid. We've changed the culture in areas like that. We can change it as it relates to individuals. So can Illinois address these types of problems and move from laggard back to leader again? And I say yes, but it won't be easy. Now I say yes because the strengths are so significant, but we don't think about them and we don't market them. I talked with a couple of former directors of the State Economic Development Agency, and one of them, Jim Schultz, a very successful businessman from Effingham, said, in each of the critical 5 R's, as I call them, roads, rails, runways, rivers, and routers, computer routers, Illinois is in the top 3 among the 50 states. And of course, we're located local in the center. And we have a higher percentage of people with bachelor's degrees than most states. So we have the resources. We have to change, we have to stabilize things and change our attitudes and become more positive and start a process of long-term thinking. Illinois has never done any long-term thinking. And never. Local governments do it all the time. Businesses do it. But Illinois has never had a long-term thinking unit, either public or private. So you have lots of challenges, and as I said, it's you guys who are going to address them, not people like me, although John and I will keep trying till our last gasp, but it's going to be for you guys. So today, Illinois is strong, yet declining relative to the nation. The problems are solvable, but the big question is, will we have the will to do it? Earlier, I talked about leadership. I worry today that the quality of leadership is eroded by what I call, and Keith Bockelman and you other political scientists may have better terms for this, the professionalism of politics. By professionalism, I mean that more so than when I was a kid politician, elective office is becoming a career. The pay and the pension benefits of elected officials are becoming more important to them than they were 50 years ago. And the cost of running is becoming dramatically higher. When I was running in a competitive five-way race, when I ran for the legislature, well, both times, and then the third time, no competition. But the first two times, a lot of competition. I spent the equivalent in today's dollars of $40,000 to run in each of those competitive races. One of my former students ran for the legislature in Chicago this past year, losing, spent $1 million. Now, it wasn't her money. It was from political contributors and in this case, the Democratic Party organization. But the upshot of this is there's an even stronger desire than typical, a need to be reelected. We all want to be reelected if we're in office, but now it's a much stronger need, and because of that, it can, I'm not going to attribute this to every legislator, but it can transform a elected official who wants to be a leader into a non-leader. It isn't a question of, it's a question of wanting to make sure he or she knows what the constituents want. When you run for office, you say, I promise to do this for you. Well, in politics, you want to do things for people. You don't want to do things to people. But it's a two-sided coin. If you do something for people, it generally means spending more money. And to do that, the other side of the coin means you need to do something to people to tax them, or cut spending here so you can do something for your constituents. Have you ever heard a candidate say, if elected, I promise to do this to you? No. My point is that we may be entering an environment in which leadership is a very scarce commodity. If you have to be reelected, you have to know what your constituents want, and your constituents, good folks all, but ill-informed, may think, well, I want you to do something for me, but I don't want you to do something to me. So without belaboring this too much and closing with this kind of comment, I'll just note that there isn't a one-sided coin. Maybe physicists can find one, but I can't. The two sides are doing something for and something to, and that's what Governor Pritzker and the legislators are challenged with now. They want to do well, I'm sure of that, both Republicans and Democrats. But do they have the will that hasn't been existent in the past 2 decades to balance things? And maybe, well, to balance things, provide stability and predictability. So in closing, these are the challenges that you and your fellow students back on your respective campuses face. One, to determine what needs to be done to renew Illinois, and that's what you'll wrestle with tomorrow, and maybe in discussion here for a few minutes. And then two, see if you can muster the will to do the job, because it won't be done by solely doing things for people. You're going to have to cut things. That's doing things to people because they want those things you're going to cut, or you tax them more, which is doing things to people. In closing, I would simply note holding office is not about you, the candidate. And too often, we, the candidates, and I probably was guilty of this myself, I'm thinking of myself rather than the world around me. It's not about you, it's about what is best for the larger society. So Jack and the Institute have brought us here for what I hope will be the first of a number or an annual gathering like this, so that you guys can weigh in and say, for higher education, we need to do X, Y, and Z to bring it back. And if we do X, Y, and Z, we may have to do something to people to get it done. I don't know. I'm not here to answer questions right now, just to throw them out. So that's it for the moment. Questions, comments? We have a lot of experts here. John Jackson, Keith Bockelman. I don't know all of the other professors, but I know Keith and John are certainly esteemed in their fields and can add a lot to what we have going here, as can the others with us. So questions, comments, observations? Yes?
You argued that we are declining compared to the nation as a whole.
Yes.
But I guess I'm wondering, is the nation as a whole in some ways improving while we're remaining relatively stable, or on what basis are you saying we are specifically declining?
Yes, your point is well taken. We are declining relative to the rest of the nation. Our growth in jobs, for example, in the past 20 years has been much slower. We've grown some jobs. Well, we just now this year got back to where we were in 2010 in terms of number of people employed in Illinois. But the number of jobs in the Midwestern states around us and the nation as a whole have grown much faster. So yes, it's a relative thing. We have not declined absolutely, but we have grown much more slowly than the states around us, and even more slowly than the nation as a whole. So yes, while Illinois was declining in terms of per capita income relative to the rest of the nation, the South and Southwest, which were very low at that time, were growing more rapidly. So it's a relative thing. Yes, sir. Yes, please.
You talk about, well, one thing that you mentioned in your paper was the business environment. And I'm curious, how much of that has to do with the size of the tax burden that businesses face versus the uncertainty of the future of the state and state finances?
Another good question. Size of the taxation and uncertainty. They're both important. Size of taxation, and this can be debated. Governor Pritzker has proposed a graduated income tax, which I would note for John's discussion tomorrow. If it cannot become effective before fiscal year 2022 because there are a lot of steps that one must go through to reach in terms of public approval and so on at the ballot box. But in terms of taxation, Illinois is generally considered to be among the top 10 in state and local tax burden per person, per capita. Okay. And our property taxes are, along with New Jersey, the highest per capita in the nation. Our income tax, among states that have an income tax, 7 do not, is moderate to moderately low at 5% flat rate. But Texas and Florida, where lots of Illinoisans are going, have no income tax. And that puts us certainly at an actual disadvantage relative to those states. The state bird of Texas is the sky crane. I mean, there's just a lot going on down there, even though it's out of the way. But, so taxes are high, not the highest. Okay. Perception, well, let me just go on to uncertainty. I think that's an even bigger problem because people don't know what the future holds. I mean, if you're a businessman and you employ 100 people, that'd be a big business to me. I've had some small businesses, smaller businesses than that, but it'd be a small business. If you employ 100 people and you're thinking about coming into Illinois, you have to think about the personal income tax rate. There's a corporate income tax, but most businesses and most startups, owners pay the individual income tax rate because they're organized in such a way legally that they pass through profits to the individuals who pay the profits as individuals rather than at a corporate tax rate. The corporate tax rate's higher than the individual tax rate. But if the individual tax rate goes up to close to 10% for that person versus 5%, that can be significant, and he's concerned about it. Another element is that of workers' compensation. How much does a business have to pay into a pot in order to cover its costs when one of its workers is disabled? And we should have protection for disabled workers. And workers' compensation costs have been coming down over the past decade for every state because we have better safety. But Illinois still has a much higher rate. So this guy who's going to bring 100 employees to Illinois or employ 100 people, he will face workers' compensation rate, and it varies by industry you're in, of let's say $3 per $100 of salary or compensation. Whereas you go to Indiana, which probably has workers' comp that's too low, I mean, benefits may be too low, they pay $1 per $100 of compensation. So that's 2% in there. So anyway, businesses have to figure all these things out, and they weigh our strengths against these kinds of issues, and they have to be addressed. And that's why it's not easy, but it's doable. I mean, the problems are solvable. Good questions, both of you. Other questions, comments?
Time probably for one more question.
Yeah.
Before dinner.
Okay. What'd you say? One more? One more? One more. Okay. One more. Yes, back there. The elementary, secondary education major.
Yes. I was wondering if you thought Illinois had any strengths when it comes to solving problems, just because there is so much corruption and everything. If you thought there was a strength that stood alone for Illinois.
Well, these resources I talked about certainly stand out in my mind as elements we should be marketing more effectively and that we should be more aware of. But other things that I might not have thought of that we could do better. And I think it would be valuable if we said we're going to take on corruption in Illinois and do something about it. Now, corruption doesn't mean we're all corrupt or that you go outside and you get a ticket in Carbondale and that you can buy off the cop. That is, it isn't as if corruption is pervasive, but it has been so significant that people in other states are aware that if you come into Illinois, it might be a little dicey to do business without greasing the skids by putting some money in somebody's pocket or what have you. Perception is often worse than reality when it comes to these things. So if we can address the perceptions and say Illinois is going to take on the issues that we face, and maybe Governor Pritzker is going to try to do that, then that will be good. That's it, Jack.
Good morning. I'm John Shaw, the director of the Institute, and I want to reintroduce myself and also to thank all of you for being here. In the spirit of the times, I think I'll begin with a brief apology tour. First, rousing you out of bed this early and checking out of a hotel before 8 o'clock is sort of a cruel thing. I know I was telling someone, if I check out of a hotel before 9 o'clock, I feel like I've been deprived, even when it's a free room. So thank you for getting up and about so early. Second thing, the heating in here is a little uncertain. I don't know if your schools are like SIU, but the change of seasons poses a kind of an existential challenge to our systems, and it's usually like you have the heater on until May 1st, and then the air conditioning, so you're hot and then very cold. So we've been trying to make the adjustments, so hopefully it will not be too uncomfortable. And we will not be spending that much time in here. We'll have a lunch talk here, but we'll be going elsewhere. I wanted to speak just for a minute or two about one of our initiatives, which I think is relevant to what we're going to be working on today. When I arrived at the Institute, as I mentioned last night, I'd had a sort of varied career, more out of luck and chance than great grand strategy. I had the chance, right out of school, I went to Knox, worked in Springfield for a couple years. I was in the first class of Governor's Fellows. Then had the great fortune of winning a Rotary Scholarship, and they sent me to Australia for a year, and I traveled around Australia giving speeches about growing up in Peoria. And DECA had given me, the Department of Commerce had given me these little Illinois pins that I distributed liberally throughout Australia. So I think probably in antique fairs and little shops, these little Illinois pins are starting to emerge, and people are trying to go on eBay and see if there has some special value to that. So I did the Australia bit. I came back. After a year or two in Illinois, I went to Brussels, and I worked for about a year as an intern in the European Union. Then I met some people there and was able to finagle a year-long internship at the Wall Street Journal Europe in Brussels. So I was able to observe the EU from, at least that wasn't my beat, but I was able to kind of watch the EU as it worked. Came back to the US, went to grad school in DC, and then for 26 years was a reporter covering Congress for a company called Market News International. I had a little desk in the Capitol, and I'd go to the Capitol every day, so it was great. But the one takeaway from all these experiences, very disparate, this was not part of a grand strategy, was this sense that, that the leadership of the country and actually the world had not risen to the level that you would want. And you have to be careful when you say, where have all the statesmen gone? Because there's kind of a distorting aspect. John F. Kennedy, I've written quite a bit about him. When he was a senator, he said, God, where are all the statesmen? What's wrong with the Senate? And he was thinking of the Senate of Webster and Clay and Calhoun. But in his Senate, there was Mike Mansfield, Paul Douglas, Everett Dirksen, Scoop Jackson, Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson, people who historians would call giants. And yet he was in their midst and just didn't think that they were anything particularly special. So there is something distorting about just this present moment and just trying to see, who's a high quality leader or not. But one of the initiatives that we're focusing on is what we're calling the Statesmanship Initiative. And we're trying to find ways to just think about statesmanship and to reward and celebrate statesmanship. And I know there's a few folks here who are studying philosophy. Philosophers and political thinkers have been debating for millennia about, what is a statesman or stateswoman? I mean, the terms are used interchangeably. And there's esoteric, complex definitions. But for our purposes, we're breaking it down to just a couple qualities. And I want you to think about these qualities as we discuss things today. The first is vision. And it's a sense of kind of looking beyond the corner and just not trying to deal with the immediate problem, but just trying to look long term. Franklin Roosevelt, in the midst of World War II, was trying to figure out what the post-Cold War era or post-World War II era would look like. He was, commissioning talks for a new monetary system. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, was thinking about the Continental Railroad. and land grant colleges and Homestead Act. So the sense of just sort of thinking beyond just the immediate. The second thing I guess I would say is courage. Sounds like a cliche, sounds trite, but the kind of the willingness to take tough votes. And I read this week where Barack Obama was challenging the new class of House Democrats, saying something to the effect that, find a cause that you're willing to risk your career for and fight for it every day. Not a bad sort of mantra as to how you should live your work as a public servant. The notion of compassion and just helping others and trying to just think beyond your own immediate circumstances and concerns is obvious. Civility is huge, particularly for those of us who are big fans of Paul Simon, who conducted himself in a way in which everyone, even his fiercest opponents, liked and respected. I think fairness is a critical part of that. And this is an aspect of our culture that I think has really, really fallen into decline. And a quick anecdote from my experience. When I started covering Capitol Hill, I would cover foreign policy hearings with Lee Hamilton, who was then the chairman from Indiana, a moderate Democrat. And I'd go to these hearings, and this was during the first years of the Clinton administration. And I had followed Washington politics enough to know that, when your party is in power and you're in Congress, you're supposed to just throw them softballs and, go out of your way to defend your party. But Hamilton was remarkable. I mean, he challenged the Clinton administration very politely, very civilly. But he saw Congress as an independent branch of government. He didn't see himself as the Clinton administration's water boy. And so, and it's so striking because I went on to cover Congress for 25, 26 years, and that was not something you would see a lot of. There was always this instinctive sense of it's us against them, and if it's our party's in power, we'll defend the administration. And just this notion of being fair-minded. And also effectiveness. I mean, just in the end of the day, to be able to deliver. So, we lament our current state of affairs. And I thought Jim Nolan pointed out some excellent examples in Illinois history of statesmen, whether it's Governors Horner, Ogilvie, Altgeld. In American history, just think of in the last, half century, Arthur Vandenberg, it basically imperiled his chances to be the Republican presidential nominee by helping Truman pass the Marshall Plan and getting NATO going. Howard Baker put his political career as a Republican candidate in peril by supporting Jimmy Carter in the Panama Canal. Margaret Chase Smith, a first-term senator from Maine, challenged Joe McCarthy very publicly. Richard Lugar, a senator who I like and I've written about quite a bit, challenged Ronald Reagan on economic sanctions. And then he later worked with Barack Obama on an arms control treaty. And Republicans are saying, why are you working with Obama? And he said, if this treaty was no different except that it had a Republican name on it, every Republican would be for it. But now Barack Obama's name is on it, so 75% of my caucus is against it. And Democrats do the same thing. This is a bipartisan a malady, I think, that has infected our political culture. So just to kind of close, in terms of just the challenges of statesmanship before us, I think in Springfield there's some very specific challenges. I mean, you have a new administration in power. The Democrats, in a certain sense, own Springfield. And they've issued some fairly blistering critiques of the Rauner administration, but now they're in power and they have the opportunity to affect change in a big way. And there's going to, as we'll talk about a lot, and I think in all of our sessions, there's going to be a tendency to do incremental things and just nudge and nudge and nudge and maybe nibble around the problem. But I think for them, there's the challenge of power and doing things right and doing things effectively. And for Republicans, it's very easy to be the opposition party. As Glenn Pichard and others will say, it's easy to sit back and just throw hand grenades at the other folks. But to actually be part of a constructive minority that offers solutions and actually helps out when you agree with the other side is something that I think is really critical. So I think Springfield over these next year or so is going to be an amazing laboratory to see if statesmanship can reemerge. In Washington, I mean, it's hard to know where to start. I mean, I think one thing, I covered budget policy for 25 years. And it showed kind of in spades the weakness of our political system in which we are just unable to solve problems before they're crises. We could have made very minor adjustments in budget policy 25 years ago, and the world would look really, really good. but there was just this inability and this resistance to make incremental changes. It might have required taking tough votes early on, but that didn't happen. So I think, look at our fiscal situation. You know, we are in almost a full employment economy and have $1 trillion a year annual deficit. That is, I mean, it's completely off the radar screen, but it is unbelievable state of affairs. And I don't see any short-term prospects, but as the 2020 campaign gears up, it's going to be really interesting to see if someone just embraces the mantle and says, this is just not a way to run the government. And the Mueller report, I mean, you've read and heard a lot about the summary, and even that, I think, almost exemplifies what's gone wrong. There's a 4-page summary, and Republicans have said, okay, total exoneration, victory lap time. And the Democrats, you know, in an opposition stance, have said, I mean, they've assumed the absolute worst in the report. And it seems like, you know, we're at a state of affairs would it'd be in everyone's best interest to just get the report out and have, you know, a fair reading of it and hearings and so forth, rather than each party just sort of spinning a 4-page summary in a way that is to their short-term benefit. The one tangible thing, I'll stop here, that the Institute is working on is we're going to be producing a book at the end of this year on statesmanship, a citizen's guide. And it's going to have 2 dimensions. One is going to be to raise the sort of questions and expectations we have of our leaders. You know, the qualities that we expect in them, several of the ones that I mentioned. But also it's going to challenge citizens to be better citizens. And one of the, I think, the challenges for all of us is to hold our own party to a higher standard than the other party. I mean, there's sort of this notion now that, you know, the other guys are awful. We may not be great, but the other folks are even worse. So let's just, rather than saying, hey, you know, if I'm a Democrat, my people should be better than the other guys, not just a little bit not as bad. And likewise, if I'm a strong Republican, my people should be better, and I expect more out of them. And that's something that you don't see a lot in life and certainly in politics, to just really demand a lot of leaders, and also your leaders, your people. So I think that's going to be one of the challenges all of you face as Illinois tries to move forward in the years ahead. So let me stop there, and I'm going to bring my friend and colleague Joe Locker forward, who's going to walk through the sort of chronology of events today, specifically referring to the breakout sessions and how they'll be structured. Then we're going to be back here for lunch with Erica Harold, and then we're going to break into cabinet meetings in which you are going to be charged to assemble a sort of state of the state report that we could actually send to the governor and the General Assembly and let them know what some smart Illinois University students are thinking about the future. So with that, let me turn it over to Joe. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for your active participation today. I sat through all 3 sessions, and I know they were very lively and energetic, and we have more work to do, but I think everyone feels very good about how we've started. I am going to introduce our luncheon speaker. She's going to speak for about 15 or 20 minutes. She and I are then going to have a brief discussion, and then I'm going to get out of the way, and she's going to just take questions from you. So continue eating, of course. Erica was very gracious to be willing to plow through as you're eating, because I know it's a little daunting when you're speaking when everyone's eating, but I'm sure all of you will be very polite to her. As I was thinking of the best way to introduce Erica, I was recalling a moment in the early days of the Kennedy administration. Kennedy kind of famously had brought the best and brightest to Washington. And so there was talk, you know, the city was abuzz of all these Ivy Leaguers coming to town, and Phi Beta Kappas and Rhodes Scholars, even a few Nobel laureates. And even Lyndon Johnson, surprisingly, kind of got caught up in this. And he spoke to his mentor, Sam Rayburn, a crusty Texan, and said, you know, Mr. Speaker, these guys are amazing. They're so smart. They have all these amazing educations and degrees. And Rayburn said, Lyndon, that sounds really good, but I'd sure feel a lot better if one of them had at least run for sheriff once. The point he was making, of course, is that, you know, politics, there's the real world of politics requires both, you know, intelligence and experience, but also having kind of brave things like pesky voters who have sometimes unreasonable demands. And our luncheon speaker has both an amazing academic background and has also run for sheriff or attorney general, which is pretty close to sheriff in our current terms. Erica Harold is from Champaign. She went to U of I, Phi Beta Kappa graduate in political science from the U of I, went to Harvard Law School, has had a great legal career in both Chicago and in Champaign, and has done some really wonderful work in anti-bullying, prison fellowship issues, criminal justice reform. She ran a very dogged race for the 11th Illinois district, challenging an incumbent Republican, and making a really strong run of it. And then in 2018, was a Republican nominee for Attorney General and ran an excellent race, ended up winning 91 counties and over 2 million votes, almost 2 million votes in a year that was very, very difficult for Republicans to get any votes. So. And I just on a personal note, I met Erica just briefly last summer. She was doing a listening tour of Illinois. This was in the summer before the fall campaign really fired up. So she came to Carbondale, and it was interesting because she did something I hadn't really seen many politicians do before, which was listen. She gave a kind of a brief background of her experiences, but then just sat back and listened to people and did really a remarkable job in connecting their stories to her story and things that she had heard on the campaign trail. And just, it was really quite an interesting display of just empathy and listening and drawing connections. So with that, I'd like to have Erica come forward and speak, and then she and I will have a bit of a chat. So Erica Harold.
Well, thank you very much for that gracious introduction. I'm so excited to be here. This has been the date on my calendar that I've been most looking forward to because of what it represents and the potential that's present within this room. And I'd sincerely like to thank John Shaw and the Paul Simon Public Policy Institute for inviting me to be part of an event that I hope occurs every year and becomes an annual event. I just want to underscore how impressed I've been with both the planning and the execution of this summit. And I know that things like this don't just happen organically, they happen because people put a great deal of intentionality to it. So please give the staff of the Institute and all who organized it a big round of applause. I'm also really excited to see each one of you here because when we talk about what are the hopeful opportunities for the state of Illinois, it really is people like you choosing to stay in our state after you graduate, choosing to invest your time and energy in trying to reimagine our state. And so it's exciting to me that so many of you thought it was worth your time and energy to be here and that you've been such active, engaged participants. Trying to renew Illinois and reimagine our legal system within our state was my impetus and catalyst for choosing to run for Attorney General. For those of you who aren't very familiar with what the office does, it's one of the most powerful platforms in Illinois for a lawyer to be able to make an impact. The office has about 800 people who represent the state in all legal matters, but also deal with a multiplicity of issues ranging from consumer protection to workers' compensation to victims' rights. And some of my priorities for the office included fighting public corruption, reforming our criminal justice system, starting to try to improve Illinois' business and regulatory climate, and tackling the opioid epidemic. And it would have been one of the great honors of my life if I would have had the opportunity to lead that office. But although my campaign did fall short, I learned so much about our state and some of the challenges that people have on their hearts and minds, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share them with you today. Because I spent 14 months on the campaign trail. And so it's a really grueling endeavor, but you learn so much from it, and you want the opportunity to be able to share what you learned so that future people who are making those decisions hopefully can use those insights. One of the first things that struck me when I entered the race and started talking to people was how defeated and demoralized so many Illinoisans felt about the state. When I was making phone calls to potential voters or touring companies and businesses, I was struck by the number of people who were in the process of moving to another state or trying to move part of their business to another state. And they would often speak in terms of escaping Illinois, fleeing Illinois, or getting out of Illinois. And they weren't necessarily happy to be leaving, but they felt that they had no other choice. And for people who were not in the process of leaving, many of them talked about feeling almost trapped here, that they had family and business concerns that mattered to them, but they knew that their economic prospects would be better if they moved to another state. And sadly, I rarely encountered people who felt excited about being here and excited about the future of our state. I also found that many Illinoisans of both parties have lost faith in our state government and felt that it was either too corrupt or too incompetent to be able to create real change. And that leads to a level of civic disengagement that makes it much more difficult for leaders to be able to mobilize people in pursuit of engaging in different policy goals. And so as a candidate, I found that one of my greatest challenges was not trying to tell people or convince them that I could make a difference. It was trying to convince them that anyone could make a difference at this point in time. A lot of people would say, I'm sure you have good intentions, but look at our state. How could one person possibly make a difference? And that was kind of demoralizing to realize that that's how people viewed our state. It was partly, though, because of this loss of confidence in government that I identified fighting public corruption as one of my top campaign priorities. I wanted to use the role of the Attorney General's office as being our state's chief legal officer to use that as a platform to try to champion the importance of having accountable government and transparent government. And I was really glad to see this issue highlighted in the memo because it has such a pervasive and corrosive impact in our state in ways that I think aren't necessarily readily identifiable. There's first of all the perception factor that we are inherently corrupt, and it almost leads to us becoming a national joke. I remember stopping at a gas station during the course of the campaign, and there was a T-shirt that was being sold in the gas station, and it had the mugshots of two former governors on it. I'm not going to identify which two governors, but it had their mugshots on it. And across this shirt, it said, "Illinois, where our governors make our license plates." And I thought, wow, that's a really bad reflection on our state, because first of all, it makes you wonder how could that level of corruption occur? But then the other issue was, why is it viewed now that we think that's funny or a joke, and that we're just accepting of that as being sort of our national reputation? There's also economic consequences to having a perception or a practice of public corruption. When I spoke to companies and businesses, they would often talk about feeling compelled to make campaign contributions to certain politicians, or feeling that they had to hire certain politically connected law firms within their community. They felt that was the only way that they would be able to have their project or their permit approved. They thought that was the only way they would be able to be considered properly for a government job. And that creates a real economic disincentive for people to invest here. They look at other states and think, I just want to be able to be evaluated based on merit. I don't want to have to know a politician. I don't want to have to volunteer on a campaign. And so I decided to set forth some specific solutions to try to address the corruption. Because it's really easy to kind of think that Illinois' corruption problems are just that we elect corrupt people. And I don't think that gets to the heart of why we have some of the systemic issues that we face. And so one of the things that I wanted to do was to call upon the General Assembly to empower the Attorney General to have additional investigative tools to be able to investigate systemic corruption. Because right now the Attorney General's office does not have all the tools that it needs to be able to address that issue. So there's no one person within the state that has jurisdiction over all of the different political entities within our state. You have state's attorneys, you have U.S. attorneys, but they have local jurisdiction. And I thought it was really important to have one person within the state of Illinois that was empowered to do that. And so that was one solution that I set forth. Another was to enhance the Attorney General's enforcement authority with respect to what are called the Sunshine Laws, the Freedom of Information Act and the Open Meetings Act. And that's so important because Illinois has almost 7,000 units of government. We have more units of government than any other state. What that means is that we often find it difficult to know exactly what proposal is being evaluated by what public body, knowing whether they're actually complying with the laws for disclosure and giving people notice of the meetings. And so with so many different units of government, it's imperative that those documents be made available to citizens, watchdog groups, and members of the media. And the Attorney General's office has some authority to enforce those laws, and I think there need to be additional resources because it's a starting point of trying to provide the right incentives for transparency and accountability. I also think our ethics laws need to be strengthened. Right now, we have certain laws that allow kind of conflicts of interest to occur with government actors and the kind of ways in which they make money outside of their government service. The extent to which we can take away those conflicts of interest, I think, will make people feel that the decisions that are being made by their local officials and their elected representatives are being based on the community's interests and not the interests of some sort of economic benefit. And part of it is actually trying to put that transparency in place, but it's also making the public feel that there are people watching out for them and that there are people making sure that their interests are being taken into consideration. And then the final thing that I said is we need to have an attorney general that highlights this as a really important issue. And even if you don't have all the statutory authority that you need somebody who's passionate about why government needs to be transparent and why it needs to be accountable. Not just talking about why it's bad to engage in corruption, but talking about the benefits economically for each citizen to have a government that's transparent and responsive and accountable ultimately to them, because that's what democracy is about. And I heard that you had a really robust discussion about some of these issues, and I'd be really interested afterwards to hear what your ideas are, because this is one of our most important issues. Another key issue that I noticed while campaigning was Illinois' diversity and the need to be able to take that into consideration when you're affecting public policy change. In many respects, Illinois is a microcosm of our country. There's a blend of rural and urban communities. We have a diversity of people and backgrounds, diversity of industries, and there's also diversity of political opinion. You can't just say Illinois is this type of state. Based on the region, some are red, some are blue. And the issues that people would raise with me on the campaign trail really varied based on where I was located. So if I was in Marion, I would hear issues that were different from Rockford. If I was in Quincy, I would hear issues that were different from Chicago. And one of the things that I realized from this is that oftentimes one-size-fits-all solutions aren't going to be most effective in being able to create broad change for the entire state. And that it's really important to be able to empower local decision makers to be able to figure out what is best for their particular community. And I'll give you a specific example. One of my priorities during the campaign was criminal justice reform. So bail bond reform and trying to incorporate more educational and vocational programs within the jails. And as I was talking to state's attorneys and law enforcement, they were telling me how their ability to be able to comply with those mandates and to be able to incorporate those programs really was based on the personnel that they have. In some counties, they only had 1 or 2 people who would have been able to adopt those programs. In other counties, they'd have 100. And so I realized if you want to have a program that's actually effective, you have to make sure there's sufficient resources to be able to effectuate those programs. And as we're thinking about how do we fix Illinois, taking into consideration the resource disparities between counties is really important, because I think that's the best way of making sure that each county is actually able to comply. Another way in which I saw this sort of local-based decision-making come into play is in the area of job creation and employment. Oftentimes, you hear people lamenting the lack of jobs. One of the things that surprised me when I would go into communities is the number of businesses who had job vacancies that they had not been able to fill for years. And there seemed to be a mismatch between the specific job needs within a community and the workforce within that community. And one of the ways I think we can start to address that is to continue to foster partnerships between colleges and universities and companies that are located within their general area. Because if you can have people trained to be able to meet the specific needs within that community, it's more likely that you will have people stay after graduation. It's more likely that businesses will feel confident that they can expand. And that's how you start to revitalize the kind of economic situation that Illinois faces. And I mention that because solutions like that, I think, are critical when you're thinking about how do we reverse trends of economic decline and out-migration. And during these discussions, I really came to realize that when we think about government and change, we often are just thinking about statewide leaders and members of the General Assembly, but that we should be thinking a lot more about mayors, village presidents, city council, because they are empowered in ways to be able to make change, and the extent to which we can have decisions being made at that level, I think they are actually going to be able to oftentimes be more responsive. Another observation I made while campaigning was the need for better collaboration across communities in order to address statewide challenges. One area I saw this in particular as it related to the Attorney General's office was tackling the opioid epidemic. I was holding town halls in communities to find out how that opioid epidemic was affecting their particular community and what were the things that Illinois needed to do better to help save lives. And time again, I heard that law enforcement would often arrest people for an opioid-related incident, and they would actually wish to give that person the opportunity to go into treatment as opposed to being incarcerated. And that person would agree to do that. But the problem was, if they didn't have a space in a treatment facility in their area, they weren't able to take advantage of that opportunity. And with people who are battling addiction, if they've decided that they are willing to enter treatment, that's the point in which you need them to be able to go into treatment. If you wait a couple months, you may have lost the best opportunity to be able to save lives. And so then I said, well, do you have the ability to find out if there are treatment facilities open in other counties? Because many times loved ones would happily volunteer to drive their loved one to a treatment facility, even if it was several hours away, if it meant that their loved one's core addiction issues could be addressed. And they said, there is no such way of doing that. And I said, well, a cost-effective way of managing that is there should be a statewide database in real time that allows law enforcement to see how many beds are available in a particular place. Where are they? What are the insurance requirements to get that person treated? And be able to do that very quickly. And I was shocked to find that no such database exists, because all of this data is already being collected each day by each of the treatment facilities. So it's not imposing any additional mandate upon people. It's not imposing any additional cost. It's just saying, let's make the best use of the resources that we have, because we don't have the opportunity to squander that. And I think thinking in very concrete terms is important, because it's easy to say, well, let's eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. But unless you can actually say, how do we streamline specific procedures and specific mechanisms, we'll never actually be able to see real change. I also think it's really important that we look, though, why is it that we don't see cooperation and collaboration? And what I noticed is that essential to fostering the type of collaboration that we need is to enhance the level of civility within our political discourse. While campaigning, I observed that our political culture almost incentivizes conflict and demonizes compromise. And it takes away people's incentive to work together on issues that really aren't partisan. One of the things that was surprising to me is most of the key issues in Illinois do not fall along Republican-Democrat lines. They are issues where there are real answers, and people could find them if you could get them to sit down at a table and not worry that their comment might be used against them in some other forum. And so trying to figure out how we can change that level of toxicity is imperative, because we can have all the great ideas in the world, but if you can't get a policymaker to actually propose a bill and to get other people on the other side to vote for that bill, these solutions have no ability to actually be enacted to make a positive impact. And I talked to people who had run for office before, who had held office, and they said that they have certainly noticed an uptick in the level of hostility. And oftentimes people just think of it as people raging on social media and don't think it has a real consequence. But if it prevents somebody from voting for a good bill, that's a real consequence. And it's a consequence not just for politics, it's a consequence for the policy that each and every one of us has. And I highlight the need to change our political culture because it leads me to my final point, and perhaps the reason why I was most excited to be at this summit. I think Illinois' best hope for renewal of both our politics and our policy lies engaging in people like you being willing to stay in our state and engaging in our government. whether it's running for office, serving on boards and commissions, leading initiatives, developing policy, or leading and serving in your communities. We need people like you to feel that Illinois is worth engaging and that Illinois' political culture is worth engaging. So many people say, oh, I'd love to run for office, but it's so mean-spirited. If our political culture drives people who should serve from running for office, that's a loss for each and every one of us because it means we're not getting the best people, we're not getting the most intentioned people, we're just getting the people who are willing to shout and argue and rage for a living. And that it should be no wonder why we don't have the kind of cooperation that we need. And I've had the privilege of speaking with many of you last night, and I was so inspired by the thoughtfulness and the sincerity and the talent that you bring. And that's one of the reasons why I will leave the summit feeling very hopeful. Because we have real challenges, but we have people in this room who are able to look at facts, put aside different backgrounds, and say, what would be the best way to try to create win-win situations? If you're always creating winners and losers, you're never going to be able to mobilize people in pursuit of that higher good. Many of you also last night asked me about what are the challenges of running for public office. And on a personal level, I can tell you it was both simultaneously the most grueling yet gratifying thing that I've ever done. And it was a privilege to be able to do it. And I say privilege because even amidst the 18-hour days of traveling, not seeing your family and friends for weeks on end, the never-ending fundraising calls, seeing attack ads, and really unflattering pictures of yourself on TV, it is a privilege to live in a state and a country where regular people have the opportunity to run for office, where people who don't come from political connections can say, I think I can do a better job, I'm going to step up and try to lead. And that was most powerfully brought home to me a couple of weeks before my primary election. I went to visit my grandmother who lives in central Illinois. She's 97 years old and an African-American woman. And she showed me where the absentee ballot that she had ordered had come in. And she showed me where she had already filled out the little circle next to my name. And she said that she was so proud to have lived long enough to be able to vote for her granddaughter to be Attorney General. She was born at a time when she did not have those kind of options and opportunities. She couldn't choose where she sat on the bus. She couldn't choose where she sat in a movie theater. She couldn't go to the school that she wanted to. She couldn't run for office herself, and sometimes faced challenges in being able to vote and be able to vote freely. And it was inconceivable when she was born that she would have been able to ever run for an office like this. And the pride that she felt knowing that she was able to live long enough to see some of those challenges and impediments be eradicated and be able to vote for her granddaughter, it was a really kind of emotional moment for both of us. And one of my favorite TV commercials that I aired during our campaign was the two of us featured talking about the fact that she was my role model for fighting for justice. And I mention that to you because it's easy to listen to all of the challenges of Illinois and think they're insurmountable. But if you think about some of the progress that we've made just in the past 50 years, you know that if committed people are willing to fight for change, that there's nothing insurmountable. And if we can overcome some of those barriers, then we can certainly deal with some of Illinois' economic challenges because we can all be winners if we're willing to work together and not worry about who gets the credit. So thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to the discussion that we're going to have.
I know the campaign was a 14-month probably blur, but were there any days you had that you sort of felt like you embraced all of Illinois' complexity, maybe began in a small town and passed through the Quad Cities, end up at a reception on Lakeshore Drive and say, I feel like I've been in 3 different planets today, let alone the same state? I mean,
during the listening tour, I felt like that most days because we had a concerted listening tour during the summer right before the general election, and the purpose was to reintroduce the campaign to people who were just tuning in for the first time and to really listen to people and to do it from a perspective that wasn't political. So to have town halls that people would come to that were just focused on specific issues. And there was one day where we were in the Rockford area, and we had 16 different stops. And by the end of it, I thought, I can't remember if I've told this story before, I don't remember what day it is, but it was exciting because I thought, what other opportunity would you have to meet that many people, to hear that many concerns, and to be changed in that many ways?
I'm going to ask one more question, then I'm going to turn it over to you. We've had a chance to talk a little bit the last day and a half, and I've noted just the wide range of interests you have, you know, sports, music, books, politics, travel, etc. In my experience writing about political people, oftentimes they have a very singular focus. I mean, part of being, for many people, to be successful in politics is to be utterly focused on the one thing. Do you worry that by having a kind of a wide array of interests, that would be a detriment to a political career?
It could be, but it won't change how I live my life, because I think that you can make an impact in ways other than holding elected office. And if you observe people who've made running for office their singular pursuit, oftentimes they're not successful in it because they aren't able to relate to enough people. And they look back upon their life and think of all of the opportunities that they missed. And what I hope to do with my life is to find interesting things to do where I feel like I can make a difference. There's not even necessarily a common thread in all of them. So I actually go into prisons and do ministry. I go into schools and talk to kids about my own experience being bullied and how that changed me, and tried to fight for anti-harassment legislation. And some of the causes seem almost to be in opposition politically, but they matter to me, and I hope they matter to other people. And if they prevent me from holding an office, I hope I've made enough impact in other areas where I don't look back with any regrets.
Great. Well, I'm going to get out of the way, and then maybe you could stand up and have a little better microphone, and please feel free to ask questions. Thank you.
Hi, so I'm currently working on a research project about expungement and sealing policy for criminal
Yes.
records, and I just was wondering what your thoughts on that are.
I'm highly supportive of it, and I'd really be interested in hearing more, learning more about your project after this, because one of the things that's so important to having real criminal justice reform is the expungement process and being able to allow people to actually be done serving their time. I'm on the board of directors of a group called Prison Fellowship. It's the world's largest outreach to inmates and their families. And we've started what's called the Second Prison Project to highlight all of the ways in which people are still essentially in prison even after they've been released. Because if your record is not sealed and if all of that information is just accessible, then any employer who decides to do just even a cursory Google search is going to be aware of your criminal record. Now, obviously, I don't think expungement should extend to all offenses. There are certain reasons why you definitely want employers to know. But after a certain period of time has passed, and when you're dealing with certain types of offenses, I think the cost-benefit analysis weighs in favor of the expungement, because it's the only way you allow someone to have access to housing. Sometimes these criminal records preclude you from being able to be available for financial aid. There are just so many ways in which those things are held against you that I think we have to work harder to expunge. The other area that's kind of related to this that I don't know if there's the right answer is mugshots and how available they are online. I'm sure there used to be publications where people would actually publish people's mugshots in books and people would buy them. You could go online and see mugshots. And so the problem is that even if somebody's record is expunged or sealed, if their mugshot is easily available when someone does a Google search, even if they were found innocent or the charges were dropped and they were never actually pursued in the first place, that image puts a certain stigmatizing perception on them. And I met with the ACLU to talk about that. The ways in which the arguments people would use against keeping those private is they want public records to be available. You don't want situations where people can detain people without there being record of it. But I think the next place we need to focus attention is, what do we do about those images that last forever? Because they always say the internet is forever. And why is it that we need to put people's kind of moments of intense shame out there in ways that can be used against them?
What are some specific tools that you would like to have as Attorney General, or would like the office of Attorney General to have to tackle corruption? And
a great question. The number one tool that I think the Attorney General's office should have is the ability to convene a statewide grand jury. That's necessary for being able to conduct the kind of statewide investigations when you're trying to address allegations of corruption. Right now, state's attorneys have the ability to be able to convene those grand juries. And if you're dealing with something that's systemic, you would actually have to kind of collaborate with each particular state's attorney in their county, some of which may or may not be cooperative. And so if you had the ability to convene a statewide grand jury, you would be much more empowered to be able to look at kind of root cause issues as opposed to just going after one-off issues. You could also use a statewide grand jury to address things like some of the sex abuse cases that have been rampant. The Attorney General of Pennsylvania was able to use statewide grand jury power to do a statewide investigation. And when you're looking at how can you deal with those systemic problems, having the Attorney General empowered in that way, I think would be really important. And then as it relates to state's attorneys, that's an issue I talked to a lot of state's attorneys about during the course of the campaign, because there's actually a part of our law, the Illinois State's the Attorney General Act, that says that certain areas have what's called concurrent jurisdiction with the state's attorney. And sometimes state's attorneys would say they didn't have a good relationship necessarily with the Attorney General. I always took that with a grain of salt because people would often vent to me about things, and so I never just took one person's word. But being able to better utilize that concurrent jurisdiction, I think is important because it puts you on the same page when you are pursuing an investigation. You don't necessarily want both people going after the same issue. And the state's attorney oftentimes has more tools in a certain area than the Attorney General, but the Attorney General sometimes is the one that's better able to bring a case if it's going to be a potential class action or deal with consumer fraud or areas like that. So that kind of gets to the collaboration issue. When you have a state like ours where you have widespread problems and not enough resources currently to address it, you have to figure out how do you leverage those opportunities to start to maximize them. Oh, yes.
So I have a question, wondering your thoughts with regards to kind of the balance between what is essentially the AG or the executive, the legislature, and the judge in terms of sentencing. So sentencing authority. Presumably no one of those three should have the final say, but whether you think too much authority has gone towards a legislature with regards to passing sentencing requirements and an executive with regards to the ability to try and charge bargain out of those, or judges, and how you think that should manifest in a proper system.
I actually would want judges to have a bit more discretion in terms of sentencing because I think that the legislature, when it enacted a lot of the mandatory minimums, I think it robbed judges of the discretion to be able to look at the totality of someone's circumstances and to be able to decide what is the best way of having punishment but also rehabilitation. And so I think that the best way of starting to shift some of that balance is people weighing in on changes that they think should be made at the legislative level because judges ultimately need to follow the rules that are set forth. One of the things that was a theme of my campaign is the rule of law and people following the authority that they have. And so even if you don't agree with something, if you took an oath to follow the law, I think you should do that. So I don't think it's appropriate when judges decide to disregard what the statute says and what the sentencing guidelines say. But that said, I think that there should be fewer mandatory minimums because I trust most judges to be able to get it right. And one of the issues that I'm studying I serve on the Illinois Supreme Court Committee on Equality, and we look at implicit bias and ways in which judges use discretion. And we found oftentimes that having discretion but bounded within parameters is the best way to get that balance. That you set forth, here are the goals that we're trying to achieve, but then give the judge the discretion to work within those parameters to get the balance right. Any other questions? I give long answers, so.
When you brought up the point of like a lack of like ethics that was the same stuff, a lot of conflicts of
And I'm going to tread lightly in answering this question without talking about any specific people, because I don't want to use this as a forum for that. But I think that the General Assembly should adopt ethics codes that make it clear what sort of jobs that people in certain positions can hold, to make sure that they are not making decisions in one arena in government that then implicate their business outside of that. And so I don't think that the Attorney General should just go on like roving investigations of people, because the only way that this changes the culture is if it's not political. If giving the Attorney General power simply becomes giving somebody the ability to go after political opponents, then actually you've just exacerbated the culture of corruption within our state. So I think the issue needs to be addressed at the legislative level, where people agree on what are the conflicts of interest that we think undermine people's ability to trust that we're making decisions in the right way. And then when people violate those ethics laws, then there are commissions within the General Assembly itself where people can file complaints, and there's a specific procedure for investigating those. One of the things I proposed during the campaign that I was probably most proud of is I think the way in which the General Assembly deals with allegations of sexual harassment needs to be dramatically changed. One of the things that was shocking to a lot of people to find was that the person who was empowered to investigate allegations of sexual harassment, that post sat vacant for almost 3 years. So anyone who was making complaints, no one was even looking at it. And meanwhile, the statute of limitations was running on those claims, and they had no way of knowing that. And so I think there are ways in which you can also change the rules of the Ethics Commission within the General Assembly itself to have more transparency. And I think my approach is very rules-based, because you don't want people just making ad hoc decisions and doing it in a way where they can score political points. You want to be able to say, this is the particular rule that the person broke, this is the procedure, this is how we know they broke it. I'm not a big fan of trying and people in the court of public opinion, because I think due process is important.
You've done a really good job at this conference of staying apolitical, but if I could ask a political question. How do you think about the future of the Republican Party in Illinois? What is the path forward?
That's probably above my pay grade. But I think that it's going to take a bit of time for the Illinois Republican Party to rebuild, because there are real differences within the party that can't easily be resolved. And so as I was traveling statewide, I had the ability to engage with lots of different Republicans. And I can tell you, I won't share my personal views on which side I think is right, but there's a real debate within the Illinois Republican Party about Donald Trump. There are some Illinois Republicans who think that the way for Illinois Republicans to regain relevance is to more closely align themselves with Donald Trump. And they think the reason why the party did poorly is that Trump wasn't campaigning in Illinois. There are other Illinois Republicans who feel that that would be a mistake because of some of the issues that matter most to people within Illinois, and that you don't necessarily want your entire political brand to be tied to just one person. And both sides feel very strongly about their point of view, and they view it as being about the future of the party in ways that they don't necessarily want to compromise, because they think compromising would compromise a core value. And I don't know which side is going to win out in the state. I think it will take time. I don't think there will just be one leader that emerges as the leader, but I think that's probably the fundamental divide in terms of the party going forward. And so you may see kind of regionally based leaders who are probably more representative of the local issues, but I will say it becomes a real challenge if you're trying to win a statewide office or you're dealing with congressional seats that cover multiple jurisdictions, because you then have to resolve it in a way where you can win a primary and a general election. And if you look historically at Illinois, you often see Republican candidates who can have a good, strong primary win, but the path they had to take to get that win makes it very difficult for them to appeal to a wide enough group of voters in a general election. All right, I've been told our time is up. Thank you again, and I want to hear more about your ideas, especially the expungement project.
Well, I'm going to turn over to Joe in a second. I really want to thank Erica for both a very, very thoughtful speech and then just how generous she's been with her time. She, as all of you know, came last night and met with people and then even went down to the bowling alley and hung out for several hours there. So she was really way, way beyond the call of duty. So thanks again, Erica. And with that, I'm going to have Joe Locker come up and kind of lay out the afternoon schedule, realizing that you guys want to get home sometime before too long. So this man has your future in his hands. So
the cost factor comes up in every instance when we talk about out-migration. Students are moving out of state because other universities in neighboring states are offering them a better cost package. They can go there more cheaply, and at least in their perception, they're getting a quality education in those surrounding states. But the research shows that Illinois has the complete package. We have some of the best private, some of the best public universities, some of the best regional open public universities in the country, but the image in the mind of our students is that we don't. And they can go to Indiana or Wisconsin or somewhere else and get that. We're not doing a good job as a state in building the image for public higher education in Illinois. And the state needs to take that on as a task, according to many of the students. That higher education is the bedrock of everything. It's the meal ticket. Putting together an integrated, publicly funded body to assess the relationship between high schools, community colleges, public universities, a better marketing campaign that may be centralized in the state to market higher education, just like the state attempts to market tourism or something else. You don't have to favor one university over another, but let's market Illinois as having a good higher education system so that parents and citizens know that and they can get behind us and behind their legislators. Marketing is a big deal, and we're not spending nearly enough money on marketing higher education or its value. Fully funding MAP grants, that's a given. Unless we want the doors keep slamming in the face of middle and low income students, we've got to have full funding of MAP grants according to the students. I didn't take down the sheets down in the room. Incentivizing people who are willing to stay in the state of Illinois past their degree. The state should get busy helping students to pay off their college debts past graduation, some kind of program. Housing. We have vacated dorms on every university in the state right now. Why isn't that being converted to cheaper housing for students? If they're empty, they're not making us any money anyway. So give the students a break. Cut the cost of housing. Freeze tuition if you have to for a couple of years to help us get back on the track. More scholarships for tuition. A $1,000 scholarship can help, but a $6,000 scholarship to help cover tuition is a lot better for students. So getting back to the mandate of helping higher education through more funding is just a given. And those are just some of the ideas that we talked about. But we kind of focused a little bit on developing the advocacy to convince the legislature to do their job. Okay, thank you.
I moderated the discussions related to governance, and we, as three groups, certainly came to the observation that there are problems related to governance in terms of traditional corruption that I focused on in my booklet paper, but also in areas such as the possibly corrosive effect of money on elections and campaigns, and also gerrymandering as something that distorts our democracy. These several comments of mine represent observations from at least two of the three groups, and of course not everybody agreed with everything that I'm going to put forward. There clearly is a lack of pride in Illinois, not among all of us, but a very general concern about a pervasive lack of pride in the state. That is a problem that underlies the pathologies of various kinds of corruption in politics. People don't care about Illinois. They want to leave Illinois. And so we need to build pride by emphasizing the good and the strong elements of Illinois. And indeed, focused on corruption as such, there was a general consensus that we need a major public commission and campaign to let the world know we have a problem and that we are determined to do something about it. As I say, there was strong support, although a few of the students said it would be a waste of money to go forward with such a campaign. So there were differences. There was a suggestion that we create a state code of ethics and promote it widely to increase awareness of the need for ethical behavior in our state. Civics education was identified as an important tool by which, over time, to improve the ethical sensitivity and behavior of people in our state. Some said civics education at the high school level, which is now required as of the past year. Others said, no, you need to start earlier, in 6th grade, when minds are being formed and open to ideas and concerns and values such as ethical behavior, and that the education should be interactive and involve role-playing and not be simply rote education, as so often the case with the infamous Constitution test that we take at various stages along the way. Actions should have consequences was an observation of several of the students. We need to increase penalties for aberrant behavior in terms of ethics. One cited Rudy Giuliani, and putting aside his politics, the student said Rudy nevertheless changed New York City and perceptions about its ethical climate, and that we need to do the same, and that there needs to be increased investigation and prosecution of evidence of wrongdoing. On the other hand, some thought that positive reinforcement of good behavior would be more important than focusing too much on the negative side of prosecution. So there were differences, but actions should have consequences was felt by a number of the students in at least two of the sessions to be important. Broader than the traditional corruption of bribery and election fraud and that sort of thing that I focus on in my paper were observations by the students that electoral change is needed to improve the environment of Illinois politics. Need to reduce the influence of money in campaigns somehow. It's difficult to do that given U.S. Supreme Court decisions. Public financing of campaigns was mentioned by several. An idea I had never thought of was to tax large contributions and maybe funnel some of that tax money back into campaigns otherwise as a way of leveling the playing field a bit. Redistricting reform by nonpartisan or bipartisan commissions as a way of making the districting fairer for everyone. And so those are the kinds of observations from the 3 sessions I moderated, I was impressed by the quality of the comments and the intense enthusiasm of the students in addressing these problems. So I commend their work to your cabinets.
I had 3 good groups. We had good discussions about what can be a very boring topic, that is budget and numbers and finance. I thank Loretta for being my handy-dandy scribe and took all that role off of me. I'm going to try to summarize what all 3 of us talked about and at least try to extract some of the stuff we had in common. I think there was close to consensus, maybe consensus, on the basic idea we've got to do something about the budget and quit kicking the can down the road, quit temporizing, quit misleading the people of the state of Illinois, and develop a plan, work toward that plan, make it transparent, and keep people apprised of what you're doing and why you're doing it. So I think the state has suffered from a dearth of long-term planning. Every time you change General Assemblies every 2 years or governors every 4 years, we march up the hill and then back down the hill. And that's not very good for long-term planning, particularly in something as important as the budget. I tried to convince everybody that the budget was terribly important, boring as it can be, but that's where the state's priorities are reflected. And when you get down to it, there are really only 3 things. Dealing with the budget problem, you can do it with cuts, you can do it with new revenue, or you can do with some of both. And we had various recommendations, various possibilities, but we mostly focused on the revenue side. I think that's because the current administration does have a plan. The whole idea of a progressive income tax the governor has campaigned on and now is going out and defending and developing the brackets. It is driving the current agenda, but as you now know, that's only relevant to 2022. We've got to get from here to there. So you start with the governor's plan. It would generate about $3.4 billion, but that's way out there. We've got a $3.2 billion deficit. So how are we going to deal with that 3.2? So we went through a number of other possibilities for this upcoming fiscal year, which starts July the 1st. And I think it was an advantage that we had just done a poll on that at the Institute. We have statewide results. We were able to see what public opinion is and what the people think. We looked at things, for example, like legalizing marijuana, gambling, more gambling in general, betting on sports events in particular. We looked at the gas tax, lack of support for that, even though most people would probably say we need some infrastructure. I think all of those had some pluses and minuses, some supporters and not supporters, but mostly I think young people are willing to sort of step up to the bar and not continue to let things fester the way they have really since the turn of the 21st century. I think a part of that was at least 2 groups said we need a narrative. The state needs to be able to tell a better story. And if the state's going to have to tell a better story about increased revenue, they need to understand that and they need to present what are the pluses and minuses, what is in it for the taxpayer, why should a taxpayer maybe support some of these things at least, and to make a more rational choice about that. The sort of shorthand was a marketing campaign that is done better. It's a matter of civic education, though, and civic education is not yet what it should be in those areas. We talked briefly, for example, about the MAP grants and how important they are. Many people don't understand that. Many people also don't understand the damage that was done when the state pulled back from 2 years of not supporting something as critical as MAP grant. So it comes down to what the economists call a public good versus a private good. Is education a public good, only benefiting the individual, only making you better able to get a job and to be able to live middle class, upper middle class lifestyle, live longer, be better citizens or not, all of which are excellent reasons to get a public education. But the polity has an interest in this, and so it is, I think most economists, and I think almost all, maybe all the political scientists I know, think that education is indeed a public good and needs to be presented in that particular argument vein. One of the examples came up twice, I think, was young people are interested in the environment, they're interested in alternate energy sources, they're interested in sustained farming or sustainability in farming. Very specifically, the tax on plastic bags is a very minor but very symbolic example of what you could do about that, and I didn't hear any dissent on that one is a good idea, or if anybody thought that, they didn't raise it, so that got some attention too. So those kinds of things, I think, attract young people. There was a good discussion of ways in which public revenues can be used in wise and judicious ways to help the private sector. Some disagreements over that, pretty sharp disagreements in some cases. We talked about infrastructure, which of course there's a discussion of in Springfield now, also on the agenda. Talked about the gasoline tax, motor fuel tax being the most likely way we would get that kind of capital campaign, which we haven't had since 2010. And I think, again, legitimately, some differences of opinion there. But we talked about the level of support in the public for all of these options. And I think in conclusion, we talked about the fact that higher education's got to be about making you folks more competitive in a global economy. You can be as parochial as you want to. You can hunker down somewhere obscure, but that doesn't matter. India and China and all of those folks are out there competing, and all of them are coming after your product, your job, your service, and you'll be getting somebody from Mumbai telling you how to fix your computer before you know it. In fact, I already do have that experience. So I think being able to get higher education geared so that young people can stand toe-to-toe with those Chinese students, Indian students, Pakistani students, that's what higher education has got to be about, admittedly a part of what Glenn Pichard dealt with, but I think probably consonant with what Jim wrote about and what it sounds like Glenn's group talked about. Someone brought up the fact that we are an aging economy, or an aging population, which I'm keenly aware of. So what does that mean about the future of you young people who've got to take some care of us geezers somehow or another? And that's a whole opportunity for careers and a whole drain on public resources if we're not careful. So in conclusion, it is a cliche, but it is also a grinding truth. You are our future, and we've got to depend on you to have that level of civic education, that civic consciousness that takes this state deep into the 21st century. So I think meetings like this, groups like this, are really a good start in helping us get started down that path and on the way to dealing better than my generation did with these very crucial kinds of issues. So that's it for me.
Okay, so we are the first cabinet. So our overall goal is to just look forward to the future, have a sustainable plan for Illinois, especially with lasting infrastructure that is stable and is not going to collapse after changes are made. And so our first big issue and priority is the image and perception of Illinois, not only by citizens of Illinois itself, but also of the nation as a whole, instead of being a joke to everyone else and being viewed as corruption, wanting to have some sense of pride, and not just saying, well, that's just Illinois. Illinois is corrupt. Whenever somebody does something that we don't agree with, we're not just going to say, well, it's fine, it's Illinois. We have to expect the corruption. So holding our representatives to a higher standard and actually trying to have some pride in our state as opposed to just having regional pride that we often see. Or whenever somebody else from another state is like, oh, our state's great, then we will defend Illinois, but we won't normally say Illinois is fantastic. And a large part of kind of our plan for that is to implement marketing campaigns to show that there are good things about Illinois, to show that we have a great education system, and that we can change the perception through different campaigns, kind of like the Don't Mess with Texas thing that was very effective for them, but creating something for us that has the same effect and that lasts beyond just a year or so in social media and that sort of thing. So that's our first part of it.
So one of the ways we were looking to help solve our financial budget of Illinois is to help with new sources of revenue. So there were a few proposed to us, such as the gas tax and the plastic bag tax. And while the gas tax did not exactly poll well with public opinion, actually Casey says in California they did something similar where they did a gas tax and they actually had a very successful advertising campaign with it, where there were signs that showed, oh, these roads are being paid for by the gas tax. So I think that in order to pass that, you really need to drill in the marketing aspect of that. And I think that that's really helpful. You know, you see toll roads always just taxing people, and people are like, where does this money go towards? So if you actually see physical progress of, oh, this is where your money's going, people will probably support it, and that would be helpful towards alleviating some of the budget woes that Illinois has. So another one we have is the plastic bag tax, and that ties into the environment. You know, we will receive revenue for this, and hopefully it will help cut down on plastic in our state. So some other environmental aspects we wanted to focus on were bringing more renewable energy jobs to Illinois. So there is a great deal of flat land in this state, as some of you may know, and that is highly marketable to wind farms, and hopefully we can bring more large corporations such as GE and all these big companies that can give us their money so we can produce renewable energy. And we also want to do that with solar farms. University of Illinois has a very large solar farm, and hopefully we can implement that at other public universities to have more renewable resources instead of dirtier sources of energy like fracking and things like that. So.
Last but not least, higher education. The reason behind this is the idea of if Illinois invests in their students, the students in return will invest in Illinois. So having incentives such as internships or actual jobs that partner with businesses while students are actively involved in campus. Also, residency in Illinois. So, for an example, students will get maybe a reduced price in residency or some sorts of stipend or something like that if they went to school here in Illinois. Another incentive would be for housing in the university. So what I've heard from most of the schools here, and I know like NIU, we have a lot of dorms that are vacated. So to have some kind of housing scholarship where students can still have like a reduced price in housing and the school is still getting some sort of money. And then also we have better marketing for our schools in Illinois and market outside of Illinois into the surrounding states.
Yeah, I mean, overall, that's just kind of our plan. So obviously marketing is a big part of our strategy, and just creating a better image of Illinois for our own citizens and those of us who have grown up here, or, chosen to go to college here and don't have a sense of pride. So our big focus is trying to create a new image for Illinois, and through marketing Also raising revenue through some new kind of methods that may be unpopular at first, but after the initial kind of period of shock, typically turn out to be not a big deal to most people once they get over the initial kind of retaliation towards it. So that's what we have for our cabinet.
Cabinet 2.
Yep. You up, buddy?
They had a laptop over. Hi, we're Cabinet 2, and I'd like to echo many of the sentiments that came from Cabinet 1. And one of the things that I really wanted to focus on was higher education. Something that we heard over and over again is that higher education and education in general is just the bedrock to Illinois. Without higher education, we won't be able to move on to things such as the sustainable practices in farming or green energy in the future if we cannot teach the citizens within Illinois those practices and those advancements, or the ability to make new advancements in the future. And one of the key things to this is improving and increasing the amount of funding for the MAP grant. Because without the MAP grant, we're going to continue to export the students from Illinois to Missouri, Wisconsin, Kentucky, and Indiana, where they believe they can get a better education for a better price. But if we can increase the MAP grant, we're going to be able to retain these wonderful students in the state of Illinois. Not only this, we also thought something like a state-backed transfer system to stabilize and make the transfer between schools and like community colleges and state-funded universities much easier, because that is something that has been missed in higher education, is that you can take classes at a community college or even a dual credit program in high school, and then you have issues transferring those credits to the education that you want to get, such as at SIUC or SIUE or even at McKendree University, where I go. This is a major issue that is a major, and if you're not able to transfer these credits, why go to those universities in the first place? You might as well go out of state. This is another place why people will continue to leave the state. If they can't use the credits that they have garnered in the state already, why stay here? Another thing that we had thought of in Cabinet 2 was that a state-funded loan forgiveness, if they plan on staying within the state for the next 5, 10, however many years that is set, but something that forgives these loans and incentivizes more people to not only stay in Illinois, but to come to Illinois. Because if they know that they're not going to have to pay back or pay less, or they're going to have to pay less on those loans, then they're more likely to come here and stay here, because they're going to have less of that burden on them. Another thing that we also thought was going to be very important is having specialized education and marketing those that already have specialized education, such as here at SIUC. They have one of the best automated technology programs around, but something that I feel like that's just not known to many students in Illinois as a whole. So they just overlook this and go to other universities instead. This can also be together with ag. We are a huge agriculture state. We have a lot of farming in the state. We need to revitalize that sort of education here to make sure that we can have better sustainable practices in the future. But even though higher education is important, we must start at a lower level, such as the high school. Because if the high schoolers don't understand all of these things, such as the colleges that are available, then they're not going to stay in Illinois anyway. And one of the fundamental things to do this is change the way that we actually fund these high schoolers. Currently, we fund through property taxes, and this only perpetuates the cycle of poverty upon those, because if a place has low property taxes coming in, then their schools are going to be underfunded. If we can find a different funding mechanism for these schools, we can break that cycle and give a proportionate and equal opportunity to all students in Illinois.
All right. I just want to preface this by saying don't judge the handwriting or the spelling. I hate writing in front of people. So anyways, I'm going to be talking about good governance and making the state of Illinois have a reputation for a government that works for the people, by the people, and is comprised of the people. I know that's kind of a cliche, but at the end of the day, that's how you create an environment in which people feel like their voice matters in their government. So first and foremost, we need to tackle redistricting in Illinois. And as we know, the problem of gerrymandering is very pervasive, not only in the United States, but especially in Illinois. We have districts that go this way, that way, and the other way, and we can't do anything about that because it's just out of our out of our hands, and it's up to the state legislature, which is a political organization. So if we were to commission some sort of bipartisan organization or an independent agency to redraw the districts along non-political lines, but simply make it so that each district is as equitable as possible, having similar proportions of minorities and other sorts of important representation that needs to be in the legislature, but also not drawing district lines along political lines so that the Democrats constantly have an advantage or the Republicans constantly have an advantage. So that's issue number one, in creating a better governmental system that people feel like really works for them. Issue number two is tackling this idea of pay for play or quid pro quo in Illinois. And this idea has been very pervasive all the way back to our state's conception. And one of the ways that we can do that is by starting a no-nonsense or a no-tolerance policy in the state to say, if we catch someone engaging in some sort of pay-for-play or quid pro quo or things of that nature, then we'll throw the book at them. We'll put the Attorney General's resources into everything behind prosecuting them and making sure that it is known that the state of Illinois does not tolerate that sort of behavior. And maybe that's a bit of a harsh reaction to it, but it is my contention that that sort of harsh reaction is necessary if we're going to get a government in which people really feel represented by their leaders. See, oftentimes citizens, I don't want to say take a great deal of joy, but are very happy when the government prosecutes a corrupt politician. And in one hand, that's almost a vindication of what they believe in and what they've always thought of politicians. But on the other hand, that's them realizing that at the end of the day, they still have a voice in their government, and they see their government working for them. So again, starting some sort of policy that's also very public, I might add. We make sure that these aren't show trials and these aren't trials by public opinion, but we make it known that the Attorney General and the state's attorneys around the state will not tolerate any sort of corruption or using public funds for personal gain. And later on, we'll touch on how this will increase the hope and the pride in our state. But at the end of the day, I'd like to reiterate the fact that making sure that it is known that our government works for the people, by the people, and is comprised of the people is the most essential fact that we have to face if we're going to do anything in resolving our numerous issues in the state of Illinois.
So corruption has found a way to be a pillar on the foundation of our state and our state government. I believe it's because we don't have a deliberate written ethnical code. I went to have the pleasure of going to school in Utah, and their ethical code is pretty strong. But here today, I learned from James that Illinois does not have a written ethical code, and I think that is a big problem. Within this ethical code, hopefully we can see more sunset and sunshine laws, better FOIA acts, more incentives, for whistleblowers, and civil education, ethnics courses in the elementary and secondary schooling system. Having this ethnical code will allow us to hold government servants, as I like to call it. I don't like to call it employees. I think we're servants, civil servants, so government servants accountable and provide deterrence to corruption. And public learning, as James called it, in Fixing Illinois as well, changing our culture and our ethics of that corruption. I think deliberate written ethnical code will help. This will then restore our hope and pride. Illinoisans have a lost sense of hope, which means we cannot and don't have a sense of pride. But showing ourselves and proving to the world, if you ask me, that we have a zero tolerance for corruption, we'll be able to restore our sense of pride and hopefulness of the success of our state.
I'm going to flip this, I guess. Yeah, so we're on budget now. And I'm going to briefly talk about environmental issues and where we've thought that environmental issues had in place for the budget. So I think one of the things we talked about was investing in renewable energy and coinciding with that, retraining programs for coal miners, for coal workers, and fossil fuel employees, because like it or not, they're going to be phased out. It just depends on how rapid that happens, and it shouldn't be their fault or the blame, and consequences shouldn't fall on them. Rather, it should be companies and the government taking them and making sure they're well supported. Also, we touched on how we used to have real great agriculture focus in our public universities, and a huge part of that was research into seeds, and whether that be like drought resistant and things like that, whereas that has largely been taken over by the private sector. Monsanto is a big company that does this, and that ends up screwing over farmers more than anything, and they make them buy the seeds every year, and it's just not a very sustainable way of farming. And in conjunction with that, water use in agriculture is horribly inefficient in lots of places, and subsidizing and making sure that there's educational outreach for farmers who have done farming for years in a maybe less sustainable way because they could, but we're facing a point where they just can't, and you need to have that change now more than later when the consequences are already here. So that's what we talked about.
I'm the last one, I promise. So we also discussed that we really need to market our services to the nation and the world in a way that encourages residency in the state. We have cheap land available. We have open opportunity to build in those communities and in those areas that welcome it, instead of continually gentrifying the urban areas that really don't want it, that have been taken over, that aren't the same anymore. We have one of the highest knowledge bases of workers, and we have all of the abilities to build this economy up. We just need to do it. And obviously that's uncomfortable, but we live in Illinois, we're used to uncomfortable weather, it's fine, we'll get there. But so some of the ideas that we had come up with along with those are that of the whole taxing campaign donations over a certain amount, changing the gas tax. Some of the ideas we had were proposing a flat rate tax, and just the entire time it would stay at something like $2.70, and depending on where the market prices are globally, that amount would then go into being the tax. We would, there's the idea of doing tax proportionally by district. So if you live in a rural community, you would have to pay less, considering that you drive a lot more. And then also, or even rural gas incentives, depending on basically where you are located at. There's also the idea of mobility grants, so moving people to downstate or to country areas, quote unquote, in order to build up those businesses and those economies, because someone from a small town, like my hometown, is dying, so we are desperately trying to get businesses in, and a lot of times they won't bring their business in if the population isn't big enough, but sometimes the population won't become big enough until they bring that business in. So with that, it's just, there's a lot of chances for opportunity, and we just have to take them. So that's committee or cabinet 2.
Okay, so we don't have 5 people, sorry. Anyway, so we decided that we were just gonna address the issues that we talked about today, and we think that the biggest issue is definitely the budget, the deficit more specifically. We believe that we were trying to think of a way to not only do what a Democrat would want or what a Republican would want, because we found ourselves kind of arguing over what we thought and how to fix the deficit. But we came up on this idea of, if we want to be able to promote jobs and business that'll help us grow later on, we're just going to have to face it that we're going to have to build some revenue. And that needs to come from taxes. So whether that be a gas tax that hasn't been raised since the 90s or the legalization of marijuana, we could put a flat rate tax on that. That'll help with the incarceration rates, taking people out of prisons, so we're not paying for them too. So that's also letting us have more money too. And then we also thought of the service tax, but not the services that could potentially harm the people that are in the lower class or things like that. We were thinking more of like a luxury service tax, so like dog grooming or something. And then we also want to make sure that there is a lot of transparency. Many people, they see taxes and they ask, you know, like, well, what is that going to be used for? We just want to make sure, like, if it's a gas tax, let them know it's going to be used to fix their roads. I know people are so tired of all of the potholes, so why not find a way to fix them? So then we were talking about education. We thought that was like the second most important issue. And pretty much, I mean, this affects the budget too. We really just need funding. And then having that funding or not having the funding, it allows the continue of corruption because there are less people going to school and learning what to do and not to do, I guess. We also need to incorporate civics classes from a young age, whether that be middle school or elementary school, just teaching people about their civic duty in voting and things like that. And then that could reduce the voter apathy and then also instill some pride for the state if they really know what they can do to help better the community. We also thought about giving incentives to stay, like in Illinois, one being like loan forgiveness. I know that that's a really big issue. That'll allow more people to go to school and stop the hindrance of not being able to. We also need to fully fund the MAP grant. If we want the students to stay in Illinois and invest in Illinois, we really need to start investing into our students better. There are people who qualify for the MAP grant that can't even get it. I know that that personally affected me, so I want to make sure that it's fully funded. Also, an emphasis on dual enrollment in high school and community colleges. If we are able to get that connection between the high schools and the community colleges, then the community colleges have the ability then to communicate better with universities. We should have transferable credits that transfer to all Illinois universities, and then it would make people, if they don't want to go straight into a university, if they just want to go to a community college, they'll be more inclined to do so because they know that their credits will transfer. And then also we need to lessen the corruption, and we also believe that this can be done through civics education, just letting people just let them learn about what's going on and what shouldn't happen. And we also need to have more oversight for the corruption, whether that be a committee like there is in Congress, an oversight committee, or anything. We just need to make sure that we hold people accountable, legislators, down to your police officer at home. So, thank you.